Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Beyond the Headlines, Post and Courier's weekly show that takes a look beyond the headlines. With me today are three members of the special projects team here at the Post and Courier. All have been involved in some aspect of the Murdoch coverage of late. We have Thad Moore, Jennifer Berry Hawes, and Avery Wilks. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that the event is being recorded. It will be sent out afterwards to your email along with other info, and you can reach out to us with additional questions if you have any. I would also encourage folks to submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And also want to plug the fact that if you haven't visited yet, we have an all things Murdoch landing page on the Post and Courier site. It's postandcourier.com/Murdoch. It's got all the stories we've written on the case, a really extensive timeline, an interactive graphic that'll take you through all the different people involved. And it's a really good resource as we get closer to the trial. So it's been 15 months since Hampton County Attorney Alex Murdaugh called police about his wife and son being shot to death at the family's hunting lodge in Colleton County. Since that time, Murdaugh's life has unraveled in a very public and spectacular way. He's been indicted for a failed suicide plot. He's been charged in the murders of his wife and son. And he has been tied to a string of financial crimes in which more than $8.7 million has been siphoned off from his former law firm and a host of clients. And that's not even to mention the web of civil lawsuits and associate criminal investigations that have sprung up out of this case. They continue to draw worldwide attention. As these proceedings wind their way towards trial, we thought it would be a good idea to check in where the case stands and talk to some of the team members, what they've uncovered of late. Avery, we're going to start with you. Grand jury indicted Alex Murdaugh on 2 counts of murder in mid-July, accusing him of killing his wife Maggie and his son Paul on the family's hunting estate. A month later, Murdaugh's defense team was loudly and repeatedly accusing state prosecutors of a trial by ambush and improperly withholding evidence in pretrial discovery. How did that dispute play out, and where does it stand now?
Well, it played out quite theatrically. The defense team consists of well-known, high-profile Columbia trial lawyers, Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin. They've been in this kind of situation before, where it's sort of bare-knuckle litigation. So a month after the indictment, they still hadn't gotten that evidence that they believe was due to them legally. So they filed motions with increasingly strong wording, accusing the Attorney General's office of playing games with pretrial discovery, like you said, trial by ambush. They simultaneously accused state prosecutors of leaking damaging information about their client. Namely the evidence against him that remains secret to news outlets in order to smear their client in the press even before his trial. Harpootlian held a press conference that was very well attended outside of his office, even though it was raining outside. He ranted for about 15 minutes on, all of these issues and how unprecedented he said the prosecution's conduct was. And then the Attorney General's office, they didn't take that quietly. They fired back in their own wording, in their own court motions, that they were not the source of the leaks, and they accused Harpootlian and Griffin of sort of pounding the table, so to speak, to generate headlines and create unnecessary drama and controversy. Ultimately, this whole dispute boiled down to a pretty trivial disagreement over how evidence was going to be released in the case, and whether it needed to be subject to a court order that would shield it from the public, and whether all sides could be trusted not to leak it. At one point, Creighton Waters, the state prosecutor in charge of this case, was saying that a bad actor in the case could sell some of this evidence because of how profiled this trial is for 6 or 7 figures. So there's plenty of incentive for people to leak this information. And so all this came down to a showdown in Colleton County Courthouse before Judge Newman. There was a lot of shouting. There were interruptions. Harpootlian even tossed a pen at one point. And Judge Newman let it go on for a while, even though he was kind of visibly annoyed at times. Ultimately, Judge Newman sided with prosecutors and ordered the evidence to be turned over with a protective order. And for the past couple weeks, as I understand, the defense team has been working on reviewing that evidence. It's a lot of data, a lot of documents. They're working to hire experts to go through it and to poke holes in the prosecution's case. And they're working to line up witnesses for the trial, which could be scheduled as early as late January, although like with many of the other Murdoch cases, that is very much in flux.
Have you gotten any sense of what's in that pile of discovery? What sort of evidence they may have? I know the state has been extremely quiet about that.
Yeah, it's been difficult to get a read on exactly what that evidence consists of. It's believed to include a video that was found on Paul Murdoch's phone, ostensibly recorded in the minutes before his murder and his mother's murder, in which he and his mother and his father, Alec, are heard speaking, supposedly. And of course, Murdoch's defense team says that they were all very cordial and they were having sort of a happy-go-lucky conversation. So it doesn't make sense that he would then murder both of them, at close range with a rifle and a shotgun. There is a lot of evidence, apparently, that seeks to poke holes in Murdoch's alibi for where he was that night. He said that at the time of the killings, he was visiting his mother, and then he returned home to find the bodies and called 911. He's also said that he was on the phone with, on his way to visit his mother and back with another attorney, Chris Wilson, and was speaking very normally. So it would be sort of odd for him to have committed a murder during that time frame, or two murders. So there's essentially a lot of forensic, circumstantial evidence, GPS data, videos, and it seems as though the prosecution is trying to place Murdoch at the scene of the crime at the time of the murders. And obviously that's going to be something that Murdoch's defense team is going to try to poke holes in.
So Jen, presiding over this whole tangled case has been Judge Clifton Newman. Charleston viewers will probably remember him for presiding over the Michael Slager case. Slager was a North Charleston cop who was convicted ultimately in federal court, of shooting Walter Scott, a black motorist, in the back. And in Columbia, Newman presided over another high-profile trial of Nathaniel Rowland, who was implicated in the death of a USC student who got into his car by mistake, thinking it was an Uber. Some big cases on his resume. What made you decide to do a sort of a deep dive profile on him now?
Well, first and foremost was just the public interest in the case. I think there's a lot of curiosity about all of the players, not only the defendants, but Avery mentioned people like Dick Harpootlian and Creighton, who will be handling the criminal prosecution. But there's also the judge who sits up there in the hearing that Avery was describing, where the pen was thrown. Judge Newman noticeably sat there very quiet for about 40 minutes while the attorneys argued. It's sometimes in real theatrical ways. But on the other hand, he's very solemn and thoughtful, almost soft-spoken and quiet. He just offers such a counter to the presentation that the lawyers offered that I thought it might be worth taking a deeper look at him. You mentioned the Michael Slager trial, and in that case, Judge Newman, who is black, was presiding over a trial that had really overt racial overtones, with a jury that had only one African-American juror on it. So it was really different than to see him in this context, where he's dealing with a number of criminal cases that involve obviously Alex Murdaugh, but also the attorneys surrounding him and the financial crimes cases. these are guys who are white and who are much more established in the legal community, people like Murdoch, whose family goes back generations and is very, has been very powerful in the legal community, as opposed to Judge Newman, who I was watching up there. He's an older Black man. He grew up in the segregated days of South Carolina, and here he is now in the position of power over these cases. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to see how he got to this point in his career on the bench and what he might bring to these cases.
Yeah, your story was a really fascinating look at that road to this point. I thought it was really kind of neat that he actually called you back and agreed to sit down for an interview and discuss things like his struggles initially with imposing the death penalty, which potentially could come into play in this case at some point. What do you think he brings to the case? And there's been some speculation as to whether he will ultimately be the trial judge here, or whether since he's been involved in some of the early investigatory stuff, signing search warrants and things, whether he'll be moved on to something else. What do you hear?
Well, from talking to some lawyers who are pretty close to the Chief Justice who will make that decision, they feel like he'll probably stay on it through the trial. Of course, that's not been decided. It's not been announced formally or anything like that, but their comments to me were that there's really no reason to remove him, nothing that rises to the level of removing him in their minds. So we'll see. Like I said, that hasn't been decided yet. But I think what he would bring if he does preside over the double murder trial is a very calm hand. He's, like I said, he's not a theatrical person on the bench. He doesn't, yell. He was very quiet when he even admonished the attorneys to be sure to address him and not each other. So I think you'll see him be a very calm force in the courtroom. He's sometimes even hard to hear. He's so soft-spoken. He described for me when he was younger, growing up in Williamsburg County, talking what he called country talk, that he had this principal who would correct his grammar and make sure he spoke in very proper terms. And so he credits that experience with making him a really careful speaker, and you can see that on the bench. Some of the attorneys I talked to, one in particular, a prominent defense attorney in the Michael Slager case, found Judge Newman to be someone who leans a little more toward the prosecution. We'll see. He was a prosecutor himself for many years, so it'll be interesting to see how he handles this case, and with attorneys like Dick Harpootlian, who's known for being very theatrical on the other hand. But almost everybody I talked to was, they spoke highly of Judge Newman and considered him to be very esteemed and someone who has a steady hand at the helm of these high profile cases.
There's so many cases swirling around here at both the state level, federal level, and everyone's wondering which one's going to come first. There's been court dates moved around just in the last week or so. It's looking very much now like the first trial in the Murdoch related case docket is going to involve former Palmetto State Bank CEO Russell Laffitte, who's been accused of helping Murdoch siphon off lots and lots of money and helping himself also to clients' funds while serving as a conservator. Just last week, and Laffitte is the only person so far charged in connection with the federal investigation. Just last week, he appears in court and takes the very unusual step of getting up on the stand prior to his trial and testifying about his relationship with Murdoch and how all this stuff went down from his point of view. And he's on the stand for 2 hours. What did you come away? You're there in the courtroom with him. What did you come away from that experience with? And I mean, in terms of his relationship with Murdoch, what did we learn about all that?
Yeah, it was a really interesting hearing, because this was a hearing really that was all about whether Laffitte needed to wear 2 ankle monitors while he's out awaiting trial. So it's really just a question, because the feds only control 1 ankle monitor. This is a question of 1 ankle monitor, and somehow that led to him going on the stand, not to talk just about the narrow issues of this question, but really like it was a preview of the trial in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. I think what was really striking to me was, I guess for one thing, how much he doesn't really dispute about what the feds have found. So the feds have laid out this case that really, I mean, Alex Murdaugh's fingerprints are all over it. He hasn't obviously been charged in the federal case. They describe him as the bank customer in their indictments. But it's really, what they lay out is this scheme, as they describe it, where he's both in a position of power as a bank executive with the ability to sort of move around money to cover overdrafts and approve loans and things like that. And also as a conservator or a custodian appointed by the court in these probate cases and in cases involving minors. And a lot of it has to do with allegations that that as a conservator, say for minors, he lent money to Murdoch from their accounts without telling anybody. But what's interesting is that he doesn't really dispute a lot of that. He would, I think, say what his case essentially on the stand is that one, he did report the loans in annual accountings to the court, and two, that while maybe in hindsight he can see what Murdoch was doing, sort of shuffling money around between accounts, he just sort of did what he was told and didn't ask questions. I mean, that was really a refrain throughout the trials. I think his words were, "I listened to my attorney." Granted, he wasn't actually Lafitte's attorney, he was Lafitte's client's attorney, but that was a refrain just over and over. The other way he just sort of described his relationship, he sort of pushed back on the notion that I think there's sort of become this perception that they were sort of good friends. They like flew on private jets to the College World Series and all this. He basically tried to create some distance there, which I thought was interesting. Basically saying, I think one of the questions was, have you ever flown on a private jet? He says no. Have you ever been to the College World Series? He said no. But he did say that, I mean, Hampton is not a big place. So he said he grew up across the street from the Murdochs. But sort of interestingly, he said that he was really closer with, I think it was John Marvin, Alex's brother, that he was closer with just because there was a difference in age. So it was a really fascinating sort of preview, or sort of, you could even call it maybe a dress rehearsal of the trial, just sort of seeing that case start to be laid out. And we'll see the full trial, obviously, sounds like pretty soon. It's been scheduled for November 8th. Should take about 2 weeks. But yeah, it was a very unusual and interesting move.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit too, you and I, about the Murdoch law firm's relationship with Palmetto State Bank. They were one of the big customers, right? I mean, it's a small rural area there. It's a state chartered small bank, and the law firm there is just pulling in millions in verdicts and stuff. So, I mean, when he called, people listened.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. I mean, what Lafitte said is that outside of maybe like a government, like a county who has deposits with the bank, he said he doesn't know for sure, but basically, yeah, the law firm and its partners were the biggest depositors at the bank. So he said, like Alec would come over and it was always in a rush. He always had some story about why he needs something to happen, but he was just kind of, it sounded the way he cast it was like it was a really like frenetic or frantic thing. And so he just sort of just did whatever. Sounded sort of chaotic. So he just didn't ask questions, and this happened. He signed paperwork where he was swearing to certain facts about the people who he's going to be representing as a conservator without even reading them or verifying the facts. The other thing, I mean, there were some interesting details about sort of I guess you could say the closeness between the bank and the firm. So one sort of unusual thing that the prosecution pointed out is that I guess the way the lawyers' payments work is they get like a big bonus at the end of the year. That's like a big chunk of their pay. And so because I guess most of these lawyers, it sounds like, have their mortgages through Palmetto State Bank, they have a sort of unusual arrangement where, unlike most people where they pay their mortgage monthly, they let them pay annually. And the reason I think that came up, or it sounds like what they were kind of going for there, is that there was one instance where Murdoch came forward and had sort of a big chunk of money in the middle of the year, not at the end of the year, like at the normal bonus time. And that was another one of these points where Lafitte said, yeah, I didn't really think anything of it. I didn't ask like why he had, I forget the amount of money, somewhere in the neighborhood probably of like $500,000. I didn't ask questions about that. So yeah, it's definitely a very unique relationship that the bank had with the firm.
And he, clearly he's trying to portray himself as sort of a toady or a lackey, I guess, doing his bidding. But will deference or ignorance, or I mean, is that a legitimate criminal defense?
I mean, I think that's sort of, I guess we'll see what the trial, where it goes, but I think that's probably the key question, at least right now to me, is it sufficient to say, oh, I just didn't know, I didn't ask questions, or do you have some sort of a, maybe an affirmative requirement as a conservator or as a bank executive to ask those questions? I think that's like, what duty did he owe there? I think that's the core question. So if I answered that, then I would be answering maybe the core question of the trial. But
yeah, I mean, it's not just Lafitte either, right? I mean, it's Chad Westendorf during his deposition in the Satterfield settlement, where he was sort of asked to explain how $4.3 million that was owed to this working class family ended up in the pockets of their lawyers, but mostly Alex Murdaugh, but also obviously their attorney Corey Fleming got a good chunk of that money as well. And Westendorf repeatedly basically made himself out to be some sort of an idiot. I mean, he was constantly saying like he didn't know what the word fiduciary meant. He didn't understand his job as a personal representative. He made a lot of claims about how ignorant he was of his role in all of this. That sort of strained credulity when you're the vice president of a fairly large bank.
Yeah, he'd not met the family, not talked to them on the phone. He's representing these folks, but has had no interactions with them. He's sitting in a judge's room as they're hashing out this settlement deal and doesn't ask any questions or really understand what's going on around him, or so he says, right? And apparently has testified to grand juries about this and to the FBI and SLED. So it really does raise some questions about the conservator system and guardians and all these sort of things.
There are actually, I think there's one or two, I don't want to misspeak there, but one or two cases where Lafitte was appointed as a PR, personal representative, or a custodian, conservator, and he just never got the settlement checks for these clients. He said he just didn't ask questions about it. He kind of wondered what happened, but figured just something happened. But later there were checks that did come in the exact same amounts for different purposes. And again, just didn't ask questions. So yeah, I think it's sort of a similar defense is what Avery's talking about. Just, I think a lot of this is sort of the limits of how far can you take that, not knowing.
But I guess we will see in the coming months. Want to get to a couple questions from readers right at the moment. Anyone could jump in. One reader asked, what is known about Chris Wilson in relation to the Murdoch case? Avery, you might be best.
Chris Wilson was and Jen, you can step in if I misspeak or if there's more context here, but Chris Wilson is a lawyer from Bamberg, who dealt with it. He worked with Murdoch on a case, a personal injury case. There was a pretty hefty payout and a lot of lawyer fees, and Murdoch ended up essentially swindling Chris Wilson out of his portion of the fees. Wilson was also he's part of Alex Murdaugh's alibi for the murders. Murdoch has said that on his way to and from visiting his mother that night, he was on the phone with Chris Wilson, and they were having a fairly normal conversation. There was no reason for alarm. And so part of their alibi is, why would he have, if he committed these murders, why would he have immediately called, a lawyer buddy and just had a normal conversation? So he will probably end up testifying in some manner, or being involved in this Murdoch investigation into the double murders, as well as the, he's a victim in some of the financial crimes as well.
Okay. Had several people asking too about Buster Murdoch, Paul's older brother. What's he up to these days? If we know, he's sort of kept it extremely outside of a well-publicized trip to Las Vegas after the double murders, in which he was captured on social media, and much was made of that. We really haven't heard much from Buster outside of his appearance on those jailhouse tapes, in which his father's talking to him about different things. What do we know about that?
So yeah, it's been a big question throughout this, is where's Buster? I think he's been spotted at USC football game tailgates. He was, I think, a tabloid photographer got a picture of him outside the family's Edisto Beach home at one point. He's again, like you said, he went to Las Vegas and someone took a photo of him at a table at some casino. So there's been some talk about whether he's, squandering the family assets and things like that. But yeah, he's really he's tried to keep a low profile throughout this. I've listened to probably dozens of Alex Murdaugh's jailhouse tapes. Buster was definitely the person he called the most from the jail. And it's really hard to listen to those tapes and to not feel sympathy for him, because he's lost his mother and his brother to some gruesome slayings, and then his father is the longtime suspect and eventual person charged with those murders. And when you hear Buster on the calls, he's really broken up about it. You hear calls between Alex Murdaugh and his brothers and his sister, talking about how Buster's doing, going to family gatherings and how tough that is for him. Talking about putting flowers on his brother and mother's grave at certain holidays and anniversaries. As far as what he's doing now, last I heard, he was working a corporate job for a restaurant chain. There was a lot of talk about him trying to get readmitted to USC Law School, which he left under mysterious circumstances. And but I've been told recently that he is not enrolled at USC Law and has no immediate plans to return anytime soon.
I believe he just turn up at that trial attorneys conference down in Hilton Head as well. I saw some snaps from there.
Yeah, that's a big that was the trial attorneys conference, that was a big Murdoch affair for years and years. Alex Murdaugh was a one-time president of the Trial Lawyers Association. He's been an officer of that group. Very influential, the Murdochs have been in that group, obviously, both in their roles as solicitors and as big-time personal injury trial attorneys. And they used to hold sort of a reception one night every year during that. And I believe that no longer occurs anymore since all of this scandal. But yeah, Buster turned up at that. I believe that was a few weeks ago.
Had another question. I think I can answer a little bit of this. Maybe some others can help out too. How clear is the evidence of drug connections to the Cowboys? So those unfamiliar with the Cowboys is a gang down in the Walterboro area, and they surfaced several years ago. Connection with a lot of drug running, a lot of shootings down there. Walterboro, for a time, that whole Colleton County area had a number of neighborhood groups that were vying for territorial dominance, I guess, and drug running and things like that, and culminated in some high-profile shootings. SLED really cracked down. The feds moved in, and a number of the Cowboys ended up going to prison. A number of big officials from the gang are gone now. But Avery and I heard several months ago that a state grand jury was now looking into the drug pipeline supplying Alec his his drugs. He's supposedly addicted to opioids and had this raging problem that ended up in rehab, as most of you know. Haven't heard a whole lot about that, other than that there was some evidence that apparently some of these folks who might have sold to him or dealt with him were somewhat easy to track down, because he would write personal checks out of his own checkbook to these folks, so they showed right up in the bank ledgers. The New York Post just last weekend published a story that we haven't seen a whole lot of evidence to support, but suggesting that Murdoch was running drugs and for half the county, and was this big drug kingpin down there, and he was tied in with the cowboys. And I don't know about you, if Avery, if you heard much about this, but I don't think the cowboys nearly as strong as they used to be, and I just haven't heard a lot of supporting evidence on that.
Well, there's been insinuations that the two newest defendants in the Murdoch saga, Spencer Roberts and Jerry Rivers, who are unemployed guys from Walterboro, from Colleton County, they were rung up as part of the state grand jury investigation into Murdoch. They were Spencer was charged with actually a totally unrelated crime, PPP fraud, and basically taking government coronavirus benefits illegally. And then they executed 3 search warrants on him, and found him at a gambling den and seized a bunch of cash and pills. And then Jerry Rivers was charged with obstruction of justice for taking Spencer's phone from the scene of that search, and then providing a separate phone to investigators when they asked for it. There's been some talk about whether they are affiliated in cowboys or other gangs, and whether they are part of this sort of Murdoch drug pipeline. And it seems like that's possible, given that we know that the state grand jury is investigating the source of Murdoch's drugs and where all of his money is going toward. It's been a huge question since probably last September. We're learning that Murdoch would steal millions of dollars from his clients. His lawyers were saying all along that's money he used to fuel his drug habit. But any person who's recovered or still dealing with a drug addiction can tell you it's very hard to spend $9 million on a drug habit over any period of time. So the outstanding question has been, where is this money going? And we believe that state grand jury investigation into the drug pipeline is trying to answer that question.
Yeah, because I know sort of some of the sources we talked to said that he was known to pay top dollar for the product, and so he was paying rates far in excess of what others would. But even at that, I mean, you'd be consuming hundreds of pills a day. You'd probably be non-functional or OD'd in that period of time. $9 million, you could probably buy a fentanyl factory for that overseas. So I don't know. So yeah, there's a big question about where all that money went, right? Still.
And it's alleged that, Murdoch, as we know, Curtis Smith was one of the earliest defendants. He's a disabled logger, trucker, former law client of Murdoch's, and a distant cousin of Murdoch's as well. And he was charged with in the bizarre Labor Day insurance fraud scheme, assisted suicide last year, with essentially shooting Murdoch to try to kill him so that Buster could get a $10 million life insurance payout. Well, now it's alleged that basically Murdoch would take the money from his financial victims and then write a bunch of checks to Curtis Eddie Smith, who would then cash them or turn them into money orders, and then he would sort of be the go-between between Murdoch and the people who were supplying these drugs to Murdoch. So, but we're talking about huge amounts of money, probably huge amounts of pills as well. So it'll be fascinating to see where all this leads.
I'll say too, I think actually the Lafitte case might be where we start to get a pretty clear or a more clear lens into where the money was going. That started to come out in the testimony last week. But obviously, one thing about having the banker go on trial is he's got Murdoch's financial records. So to your point, that was one piece that came up in the testimony. Is I don't remember any numbers being said, but a lot of checks in the latter couple of years going to Smith. But I
believe
think
it's
we might start to get
$2.4
some,
million.
yeah,
that went to
I think we'll start to get more clarity on that as that trial goes forward.
Yeah, it does seem too, if he's some giant drug kingpin, raises questions about why he apparently is so insolvent that he's having to raid client funds. So I don't know, there's just so much we don't know, I guess, still about this case. But stay tuned and we'll try to get to as much of it as we possibly can. Should probably wrap this up now. I just want to thank everybody for coming and watching. We'll try to do some more of these in the coming months. In the meantime, remember, you can sign up for any of our free newsletters at postingcourier.com/newsletter sign up. If you're a subscriber, we'd like to thank you very much. And if you're not a subscriber, you can sign up at postingcourier.com/subscribe. Until next time, I want to thank everyone on the panel today and thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us.